Testing. Whoa. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10, 2, 3, 7. Hi, Kathy. Hi, Sue. Pardon me? Well, this was a dead lady's. This belonged to a dead lady. My friend Mary Jo gave it to me. The rest are mine. Hi, Yvonne. Harvey. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12, 13, 14, 15, 20. Yeah. Do you want me to? Oh, okay. Hi, Yvonne. You're right on time. Pardon me? Well, you got a demerit on your report card. Hi, honey. How are you, darling? Good to see you always. How are those grandchildren?
Oh my God, they are so good. The littlest, or the biggest one is skiing. He's 3.
It's wonderful. Well, here we are. Do you remember, Mike Wolford? Mike and B. Well, their daughter was appointed a first woman federal judge in Buffalo. And so she asked me to say the prayer. So I'm up at the federal building, and I was sitting next to Louise Slaughter, and we got talking, and we got laughing. And I've got a picture, and the judge said, if Sister Barbara and Louise would be quiet, we could start the... Yeah, oh, yeah, did we? Yeah, we did. Yeah, he was. I could see him with the chains and it. Huh? Oh, I know it. Well, he's being kind. You know how it goes. You got your shots? 2, 1. Well, good morning, everyone. Gorgeous day. It doesn't feel like 27, does it? No. Pardon me? You can't hear me? Oh. Good morning. I want to thank Rob for making reading the books he asked me. Some people asked for the names of the books I've been working with, and so there's a list out there. The last one, it's by Timothy Keller, and it's called On Death, not just death. It's part of a series. So if they're of help, great. The second last one is one that I wanted to... This is Keller's. It's small, about $10. It's a sermon he gave at a funeral. And then this one I found absolutely wonderful. Paula Fredrickson, When Christians Were Jews. And it takes you back to the first century, the context, really, of the Gospels. It's a goodie. And not a bad read. Some of them get too technical for me, but this one is good, so I put them both on the list. So, I'd like to begin continuing the reading from Isaiah. I brought bigger print this time so I didn't have to wear my glasses. See, I took your advice, Yvonne. This is Isaiah, the third part of Isaiah, when the Jews had returned from exile. And I'm reading this suffering servant passage. It's chapter 53, and it's just 2 verses today. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days. Through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. Out of his strength he shall see light. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear the iniquities of all. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured himself out to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. That reading from Isaiah contains a couple of reasons that the early church used to answer the question, why? Did you hear them in the reading? He bore our transgressions. He picked up the sins of many. And so the early church were Jewish, and they looked back to their prophets, and they saw in these chapters Jesus. Now, Isaiah had someone in mind, to be sure, the way it's written, but I'm not sure he knew it would be Jesus. But the early church looked back, and that's why, as I've said every week, we call Isaiah the fifth gospel, because they look back so much. Before we get into a discussion today, I've thought about this when I got home, that I left something dangling. At least I thought it was dangling, and I thought maybe it deserved a little more attention. The question of original sin. We talked about original sin when we talked about the atonement, and we'll get into that a little bit more today. And I shared with you Barbara's understanding of original sin. I don't think I'm alone in this, and I'm not saying it's absolutely right. But for me, it makes sense. Remember last week when we said when we hold the children, when I held my eldest niece who has my name in my arms, she wasn't a sinner. Do you know, remember the bottle, the milk bottle with the black stain? Yeah, for those of you that went to Catholic school, yes, indeed. I believe she was and continues to be an original blessing. But her original sin is that she's human. That she has the capacity to sin, to make mistakes, and to harm others, because she's human. And that's why you and I need a community to help us stay on the straight and narrow, thus the value of baptism. That's my theory. Because you know how you rush to baptize or you think they're going to go to limbo? Remember that one? They're innocent, beautiful creatures, but they're human. And they're limited, as we all are. And they are, as Matthew Fox calls us, original blessings. Limited to be sure, but blessings for sure. I just wanted to put that little doodad back there. Any question? Okay. Now, week one, you can tell I taught school, can't you? Week one, we dealt with the who, the what, and the when of this Holy Week experience. Week two, we dealt with the why, and why the Gospels differ, and yet why they are the same in many ways. Now, we're halfway through the Lenten series. Are there any questions that popped up that you might want to address before I go into the third? Jan? No, pardon me. Any question? Okay, well, let's go today. The focus is on the Gospel of Mark. Why Mark? Why not John? We gave each one attention, but why Mark? He's the earliest of the canonical Gospels in the 60s. That's 30 years out from the execution. He's the shortest Gospel. Matthew and Luke, I'll use a term that isn't pleasant, but they plagiarized him. They took from Mark, hi Bob, they took from Mark and used it with other sources for their Gospels. That makes Mark rather important because they thought he was. The fourth reason is because he's our companion during this liturgical year. The fifth reason is because I like the name. The sixth reason is that there's an immediacy about him. Immediately, Jesus got up and did this. It's almost like an action story. Immediately, they did this. In fact, he uses the word immediately over 40 times in the gospel. Mark, which I'll show you in a minute, went out of his way to delineate on the Holy Week the days, the hours, and the time when the Passion took place. No other one does that. The book I'm going to rely on that I think is a real winner is by Marcus Borg. It's on the list. I think he's United Church of Christ, and he's now home with God. I love his writing. And John Dominic Crossan, a little Irish monk who left and married, but he's Roman Catholic, and together they wrote The Last Week, and it focuses on Mark. I also like Mark because he uses color and vividness in his writings. He's the only one to show Jesus with emotion. He quotes Jesus saying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He has a human realism about him and a rapid movement. And there's one thing about Mark's gospel that scholars call the Markan secret. So, Jesus does something whoopity-doo, a big cure or something, and he tells the person, don't tell anybody. And you'll find that scattered throughout Mark's gospel. Don't tell anybody until after the resurrection. And you wonder why he did it. Did Jesus fear that what might happen if he was revealed too soon? Or is Mark just putting off everything until after the resurrection? But the Markan secret, that always amazed me. Why? Don't go, I've healed you, Jan, but don't go tell anybody. And of course, you did, which is fine. So let me share with you, before I get into the context, what I mean by how Mark outlined this coming Holy Week. So he starts with Palm Sunday. That's pretty clear. And we'll go into that in a minute. He goes into the temple with the procession. He looks around the temple and he leaves. And he goes, Mark says, to Bethany for the night. So Palm Sunday, we get a whole outline of what he does. The next day begins with the words, the following day. And it ends with, he leaves the city. Then on the next day, it starts out in the morning. And this is the busiest, this is 3 whole chapters that started in the morning, and we'll talk about that. On Wednesday, he begins 2 days before the Passover. And I don't know if he meant the night before or that day, but 2 days before the Passover. Thursday, he starts on the first day of unleavened bread. And Friday, he starts as it was morning and ends with when the evening came. Saturday, there is silence. And on Sunday, he begins when the Sabbath was over. So that is a interesting way in which Mark outlines the week. Now, if it exactly happened that way, I don't know. But he covers all the details, and he lays out a roadmap to the death. Okay? So let's begin with Palm Sunday, which is the 11th chapter. I'm just going to summarize, and then when we get to the Passion, I'm going to read it. Okay? Palm Sunday, and you've probably heard me say this, according to many scholars, there really were 2 processions. And they were very different. And according to some scholars, especially Borg and Crossan, the 2 processions embody the central conflict of the week. Now, Jesus came about 100 miles from the north down to Jerusalem. Pontius Pilate's troops were encamped in Jerusalem. Why? Because the power of the Passover, which was coming, drew sometimes 200,000 pilgrims to the city. So what does any person in charge of a city that is going to have a large number of people, what do? Pardon me? They call out the troops. We call out the police if there's going to be something. So Pilate had fear of an uprising because he had experienced them. So you see the visuals. On the one side, we've got this itinerant preacher on a donkey. The Gospels differ. Some say palms, some say branches, and they're calling out, Hosanna to the Son of David. Going in the western gate, coming from the eastern gate, from the fortress, the Roman troops, armor, drums, color, banners coming in. They're going to keep order. And what we really have here is the struggle that is happening. Theologies are clashing. What do I mean by that? 2 theologies or understandings about kings and princes of peace. Caesar was the king, and on the coins he's called Son of God. Jesus, the poor itinerant preacher, is called Son of God eventually, and the kingdom of God. And so what we have are symbolized in these 2 processions are clashes of 2 different ways of looking at the world. And so what began to happen in the early church, people began to see Jesus as the new Moses or the new temple. Remember last week's gospel, or the new David. But this Palm Sunday really puts the cards on the table. Okay. We can't underestimate the power of the temple, because for the Jews, it was their central way to have access to God. So what we're dealing with, what some people call domination systems. In other words, Rome had the political and economic control. They dominated. The religious domination was in the temple, but they became linked in some ways. And by the first century, the conditions of the poor peasants was worsening, largely due to taxes, and eventually the temple, on some level, became a center for the imperial tax system. So you see, not only did Rome appoint the chief priest, the head priest, but they got involved in the taxing system. So you can see these two, the domination systems of the day, political and economic, were Rome, religious was the temple. Well, then along comes John the Baptist and Jesus, and they're proposing a forgiveness for sins separate from the temple. Now, think about that. John the Baptist was doing baptism, forgiveness for sins. Jesus is telling people casually, your sins are forgiven. Why is that such an important piece? Well, say what again, honey? Okay. That's right. The temple was making money on some of the sacrifices to forgive sins. That's one thing. Thank you. What's another reason why this is important? Pardon me? Authority. Is the forgiveness and access to God only going to come through the temple, or is it the central way of access to God, or was there another way as well shown by John the Baptist and Jesus? And look what happened to the both of them. John Dominic Crossan thinks this action that happened on Palm Sunday was a statement against the domination system. And it leads to his passion and Jesus' death. So it's not just saying, you're son of David and you're great, but the message is, here comes someone who's defying the power structure. And I just think it's a fascinating thing. I never thought of two processions, but it makes sense because Pilate wants peace. Okay. Any question about that? Palm Sunday. Can you see how that could get him in trouble? Pardon me, dear? A huge, very scary for authorities when huge groups gather and have a different point of view. Imagine when they heard him say, Hail, King of the Jews. Yeah, well, yes, there's another example. So this particular Palm Sunday is a nail, excuse the metaphor, in the coffin. It leads to the passion and the death. And Jesus begins the day in the procession and leaves the temple. He looks around. Mark says he looks around. And then he leaves and he goes to Bethany for the night. So that was quite a day for him. A lot of success, but warnings. Warnings. On the next day, this is Mark, still in the 11th chapter. The following day, he heads back to Jerusalem. And whether the gang with him were hungry or not, we don't know, but they saw a fig tree with no fruit. And Jesus comments, and some wonder in retrospect if it became a metaphor for the temple for him, that the temple was not producing the fruit it should. Many people were willing to die for the temple. So he goes back into the temple and he does his cleansing, a very short story. It's very quick, much quicker than the others. But the thing to remember is the cleansing of the temple was not aimed at Judaism, the people. It was aimed at the structure. Jesus remained a faithful Jew to the very end. And he's not condemning his faith or his people. He's after the structure. So the key thing to hear here is the rise of the vulnerability that's taking place. And Mark is showing you step by step how things are getting worse for him. So that Monday, he leaves the city. Tuesday in the morning is his busy day, according to Mark, because it's 3 whole chapters. So it's a big one for Mark. And 2/3 of this unfolding day is spent in conflict with the religious leaders and the temple authorities. 2/3 of it. Mark structures it that way. They see the fig tree again, and Jesus again warns of the destruction of Jerusalem. The authority question is huge in this section. So, for example, the first example of the testing of Jesus comes when they say to him, "By whose authority does John baptize?" Remember that question? And then they say, "Was it of God or was it human?" So if he said of God, then the religious leaders would be after Jesus. If he said it was human, then the average folks like you and me would be angry. So he didn't answer. He trapped them in their own question. Then he goes on in this Tuesday, and he tells a parable, remember this one, of the tenants. When the owner came to collect the profits, the tenants killed the slaves and then the son. Remember that one? And so the early church saw that as they killed Jesus. Others see authorities in this parable. And at the end of the parable, Mark writes, the religious authorities, realized he told this parable against them. And they wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowd. So can you see the pressure increasing? Then they try another test. Is it lawful to pay taxes? That's all in this chapter. And Jesus gives them an answer that stumped them. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's. Render to God what is God's. And then remember, again, they came back with another. See, they're really trying. Authority is the issue they're after here. Then they came back with the story of the widow who married and didn't have children. So then she married her husband's 7 brothers and didn't have children. Well, whose wife will she be? And he said, really? There isn't marriage in heaven. So now they're frustrated to beat the band, and one person comes and says, "Teacher, what is the greatest commandment?" And he tells them, "Love God and love your neighbor." And then he goes on in this section to criticize the authorities because of their emphasis on externals, and again predicts the destruction of the temple. And you remember, by the time Mark is written, the temple has not been destroyed yet. And the chapter ends with this, what we call apocalyptic language at the end times. I think Paul really thought the end of the world was coming quickly. They all did. And it wasn't. So you can see in this section the conflict, the testing, and they're stumped every time they try to test him, and that doesn't help his position. On Wednesday, it says 2 days before the Passover, the chapter begins with the religious leaders looking for a way to arrest him by night. They know they're going to be in trouble if they do this in the open. Jesus, in this section, goes to dinner, and I find this so fascinating, at Simon the leper's home. Well, I hope Simon was healed. I don't know who healed him, but it doesn't say a word about that. If he wasn't healed, what a risk Jesus took. And while he's having dinner, a woman comes in and anoints his head with oil. You remember that story? The courage of her to walk in to a dinner of all men and to anoint his head with oil. And then the complaints start. Well, she's wasting valuable money. We could give that to the poor. And he said, "She has anointed me for my burial." He knows what's coming. He predicts his own death and resurrection, but this is pretty clear. She has anointed me for my burial. She doesn't have a name. Luke calls her a sinner. How about that one? John has her as Lazarus' sister. Matthew does not give her a name. But Jesus says she is forgiven because she loved much. And this next line, to me, is one of the most, as a woman, is one of the most important in the New Testament. Jesus says, wherever this gospel is proclaimed, what she has done will be told in memory of her. Doesn't that sound like communion on Sunday? Do this in memory of me. What she has done will be told in memory of her. Well, it hasn't been. Except by some big mouths like me. It hasn't been. What a statement to make about her. She's preparing me for my burial. She has loved much. What she has done will be told in memory of her. Mark seems to point to her as the first important believer. And for us, as the first Christian. The woman at the well, but Mark doesn't even talk about her. So, I mean, yeah, the woman at the well became a believer. You got it. But after this event, Judas goes to the priests and agrees to betray Jesus. Why did he do it? That's the interesting thing about the gospel of Jesus. Some people feel he was trying to protect Jesus from himself. Some feel it was greed. Some feel the message wasn't what he intended. The message wasn't what Judas intended. And the Gospel of Judas seems to portray a Gnostic view that he was saving Jesus to draw him away from concentration on the human reality. But he did it. And then we come to the Thursday, the first day of unleavened bread. Mark tells that story in 9 verses. John takes 5 chapters. Isn't that interesting? Because John was talking all these beautiful, I am the vine, you are the branches, washing of the feet. John tells these beautiful stories that the early church believed and loved. Mark got right down to business, 9 verses. But in the 9 verses, the theme of failed discipleship comes right to the surface. He predicts Peter's denials. They leave the dinner and they go to Gethsemane, and he said, I've got to pray, stay with me. And 3 times he comes back and they're asleep. They fail him. Judas comes and he's arrested, and what did they do? Fled. He had predicted this. In Mark's gospel, Jesus is the most vulnerable. In John's gospel, Jesus takes charge. But not here. He's vulnerable. He's taken first to the high priest, to the religious authorities, and they say to him, "Are you the Messiah?" Straight out. And he answers, "I am." Or another translation puts it in a question, "Am I?" Either one, he responds with courage. But he's condemned to a deserving death by the religious leaders, and they and their followers abuse him. For many people, they see in this section the roots of anti-Semitism. That he was convicted by the Jewish religious leaders. But they did not represent the people. It was the domination system that said he needed to go. But that root of anti-Semitism is still with us. You know, our Justice Department talks about domestic terrorism. The threats from domestic terrorism these days are larger than foreign terrorism. Coming from white supremacy, coming from anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is alive and well. And I don't think we can ignore it. But many of the roots go right back to this week. There is no supporter of Jesus in the religious court. And the religious court, as I said before, did not represent the Jews. And this day ends with the denial by Peter. Surely you were one of them. I can tell by your accent. I do not know the man. The day ends with the denial of Peter. And the next day, he's taken to Pilate, from the religious authorities to the civil authorities. Any observation before I read the Good Friday stuff? Yes. That Jesus was antagonizing the religious leaders are you saying that he was antagonizing because he felt they weren't following the heart of the law? Why was he antagonizing? He wanted to make sure that they would. Well, that's one I haven't heard before. That's all right. Hey, I've got plenty. Yes. Can hear you. Yeah. The question is, did Jesus and deliberately antagonize the religious leaders so they'd have to follow through on their wish to have him killed? Am I saying that correctly? Well, they did want him gone, but that's an interesting observation. Interesting. Thank you. The next day, he goes to Pilate. And when you look at, this is the interesting thing about the Good Friday. I've always wondered why we call it good, except Saturday and Sunday. But the Germans call it God's Friday. I think that's a little more palatable than good. It starts as it was in the morning, and then what Mark does, he lines up what happened between 6 in the morning and 9, then 9 to noon, and Mark writes, and when it was noon, and then from 3 to 6, at 3 he dies, at 6 he's buried, and when evening had come, and Good Friday is over. Isn't that interesting, the way he lines that up? 6 to 9, 9 to noon, noon to 3, 3 to 6, and when evening came, it was over. It was the eve of Passover. Any comment? Well, let's see what we have here. This is just one chapter. And see if you hear anything different. We're on Friday now. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, the leadership. They bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate, the only one who could actually do the execution. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further reply, and so that later Pilate was really amazed. Now at the festival, he used to release a prisoner for them, anyone for whom they asked. Now a man called Barabbas was in prison, with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. Now, we don't know what insurrection, but Barabbas was one of those local violent leaders who wanted to overthrow Rome. So the crowd came and began to ask Pilate, "Do for them according to his custom." Then he answered, "Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews?" For he realized it was out of jealousy that the chief priest had handed him over. There's a telling statement. It was out of jealousy. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them. Pilate spoke to them again. "Then what do you wish me to do with the man you call the King of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." Pilate asked them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, handed him over to be crucified. Remember the first day we said very often there was a scourging before the crucifixion. Then the soldiers led him into the courtyard of the palace, that is, the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole cohort. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on him. And they began saluting him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They struck his head with a reed, spat upon him, and knelt down in homage to him. After mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloak, put on his own clothes, and they led him out to crucify him. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull. They offered him wine mixed with myrrh, and he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his clothes among him, casting lots to decide what each should take. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him, and the inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified 2 bandits, one on his right and his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who could destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." There's no mention of the repentant thief in this one. In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe." Those who crucified him also taunted him. So we come toward the end. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3. At 3:00, Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Then when some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he's calling for Elijah." And someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, and put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let's see if Elijah will come to take him down." Then Jesus gave out a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Some people see in that statement a judgment on the temple. Others see the ripping of the veil, saying the new covenant will be open to all. I don't know which is correct. Then, when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in his way he breathes his last, he said, "Truly this man was God's son." That is a powerful statement because that's a Gentile saying it. Truly this man was God's son. There were also women looking on from a distance, among them Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the younger, and of Joses and Salome. And they used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee. And there were many other women who had come up with him from Jerusalem. When evening came, and since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day of the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was himself waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for the body. Pilate wondered if he were already dead, and summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he had been dead for some time. When he learned from the centurion that he was, he granted the body to Joseph. Joseph brought a linen cloth, taking down the body, wrapped it in the cloth, laid it in a tomb that had been hewn out of the rock, and he rolled the stone against the door. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joses, saw where the body was laid. It's a shorter version. Any thoughts about what you heard? Right. I think, yeah. How, the question is, I was wondering, were some of these people, same people who praised him on Palm Sunday, and now we're at the foot of the cross, how a crowd can be swayed? I think we saw that on January 6th, how some people intended to be peaceful and got into the mood of the crowd. That's an interesting question. Had they changed that quickly? Any other question about it? Yes.
Until you started this whole, if you will, military,
Yeah, that.
the upper echelon of the Jews, I had always thought that they had been practicing crucifixions themselves and didn't realize that this was not a part of their belief, and yet they were the ones that were calling for it.
Yep.
And there was another theory that I'd always heard, was that was the start of the
Sim-
Jewish belief, because they were, quote, responsible for, the actual crucifixion. It was that Pilate he approved of it, but he was not the person who really had espoused the whole thing at the beginning. And
Yeah.
back.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely correct when they call crucify him, et cetera, et cetera. There are the roots of the anti-Semitism. But they couldn't do it. And Rome would not crucify their own citizens, but they would crucify. It was a punishment that would make you think twice before you depose them. But Rome carried it out. And so I think we need to make a distinction among three groups, and there were probably more. There were the Romans' actions, which were violent and cruel and bloody. There were the religious leaders who wanted him out of the way, and they implored Rome to use what Rome could do. But then there were the average people, Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, the Marys, who really thought this was terrible. So it's more complicated, I think, than we sometimes make it out to be. But the religious leaders wanted him out of the way. I mean, we have some religious leaders these days calling for some awful stuff. I mean, people who say, we're having a church service, there'll be 1,000 people and no masks. I mean, it's not comparable, but lives are at risk. Yeah. Any other question about this? The soldiers mocking him. And Simon, he's mentioned in several other Gospels, what that was like for him. Just grabbed out of nowhere. And what that did to his life. It's just a tragic, tragic way to end a young man's life. Any other thoughts about that? Did you see anything different in this reading than you had heard perhaps before? Jean was saying she has more appreciation for Mark than she did, because on Good Friday we read John's account. But there are differences in this one, and this one is closer to the event. And some people believe that Mark was an interpreter of Peter. Did he know Peter? If he did, he got some facts. Peter was in the garden sleeping. Peter did the denial. Peter knew Judas. So Mark's gospel is closer to the event. Yeah. Well, Mark had the specifics. I think what we have to know is the power of oral tradition. The stories were circulating. Now, maybe Mark did it this way to make it clearer for his readers. Remember, we're not dealing with history here, exact history. This is written 30 years after the crucifixion. But the oral stories started right away. And there were different sources of oral stories. One of them is called the Q source, that was circulating in different parts of the country. So Mark takes the oral stories he feels are important and writes them. He may have known people closer to the event. Matthew and Luke draw on Mark, but other oral stories. John, by this time, they have some written texts and oral stories, but they've been living the message now for almost 100 years. But the power of the oral story is something our culture is not used to. You could, yes, you. Yeah. The oral, yeah. "30, in the year 60. Well, they all were Jews at that point. So yes, stories started to circulate. I imagine the day of the execution stories started. and particularly after the resurrection, which changed everything. Stories started. Well, did you hear? But the oral stories were very powerful and accurate as the people knew them. Oral stories for us, you could start something around this room and it would be different at the end. Yeah, but they had the skill. But we're not dealing with exact history, but we know the historical facts, which we mentioned the first week. But it's a very different way of communicating than we do today. Well, there probably are a few, but expressed differently, not included. Simon isn't mentioned in every one. Daughters of Jerusalem is not mentioned except in John. So why each gospel writer picked what they picked was probably because of the needs of the community. Well, they all were clear on who he was, who his parents were, and we went through the actual historical facts. Those are not contradicted. Who got to the tomb first? Different accounts. Who was at the cross? Different accounts. Ooh, it's 11. God, I got carried away here. Let me just finish and say, throughout history, there have been different theological discussions about why did he die. So I want to lay some out. You pick what you want. I have mine. Some people say it's God's will. Well, I'm not sure I know any father that would will that for their son. But Isaiah made that statement. Certainly God knows everything, but some people say God willed it. Others say, well, even a terrible thing can produce fruit. Yes, it can. Yes, it can. I mean, look at this COVID, a terrible thing, but it is producing beautiful fruit for some people. Mark sees the death as needed because Jesus had to challenge the system. It was a judgment on the authorities and the temple. That's Mark's view. He had to do it to show there was something wrong going on. The early church, and many today, see it as atonement. He died for our sins. That's not present in Mark's gospel. Remember the story, Adam and Eve's original sin, we're born with it, and only a divine one can make reparation to God, atonement. Some say he was crucified because the powers, the domination system, said no to him. No, we don't believe who you are. Some feel it shows the depths of God's love. Some feel it fulfilled the scriptures. Some, like me, feel he was so convinced of his call, he could not turn back. That decision is yours, now that you have more facts about it, whichever one works for you. And so, my dear brothers and sisters, next week we'll close our series with the question, so what? So what? You've come 3 weeks, you've been gracious, you've spent an hour, so what? After learning all this. Okay? Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Joy the sun, the moon, and the stars. Don't forget your book list. Kathy, how you doing? How's the... We get to that point, isn't it? Well, it's as good as it's going to be.
It's perfect where you had it. I don't know what happened when you sat down, although it's unhooked from under your ear.
Yeah.
When you first started, it was there.
Okay.
And right there in front of your mouth is perfect.
Well, by next week I'll be so perfect they will want me to come back.